Hi, good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Olivia Baroni with SBP. We do have a large group, so we just ask that you keep your mics muted throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions or comments, just type them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them at the end. And please note that today's webinar is being recorded, and I'll be sending the slides out from today's presentation, so just look out for that in your inbox later this afternoon. SBP is a disaster recovery and resilience nonprofit working to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. And as part of that goal, we've partnered with the Walmart Foundation to present webinars focused on educating disaster recovery leaders to fortify people against unnecessary suffering. SBP has 5 interventions: rebuilding efficiently, sharing our model with other organizations, preparing home and business owners through resilience training, advising municipal and state officials, and advocating for policy changes and improvements to the disaster recovery industry. We believe in a holistic approach to disasters, increasing resilience before and streamlining recovery after. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to our Senior Government Advisor, J.R. Sanderson, for today's presentation.
And thank you, Olivia. So we will be hosting an in-person leader practitioner course from January 9th to the 12th. We've moved our base of operations from New Orleans to Savannah, Georgia. If you'd be interested in attending this, we'd love to get to know you. This is a 3-day intensive layout in which we talk about all things associated with CDBG-DR. And of course, this is paid for by a generous grant from the Walmart Foundation. Next chart, please. In addition to that, for CDBG-DR grantees, we have been asked to put on a Finance for Effect class. This is Financial Vision and Leadership in CDBG-DR and CDBG-MIT. This is a charged course. We are charging $2,200 per seat for the course, but we're bringing in a variety of experts from around the nation to talk to disaster recovery finance leaders. We know that finance in CDBG-DR is complex. And that it's important. And if we fail at it, then our entire program is going to fail. So we offer this course in Savannah. This is filling pretty fast. But if you have interest in it and would like to come, then certainly just let us know. Next chart, please. Over the next couple months, we're going to be holding a series of these webinars. Next month, we'll be talking about organizational effectiveness, how to put together an organization that does disaster recovery. And you can see down through here that we have a series of different, wide variety of different things we'll be talking about in the disaster recovery spectrum. I'm really excited about the March 8th one on environmental. I think that's going to be phenomenal. And of course, we continue to talk about all kinds of different things here, such as common pitfalls and business operations and recovery strategies as we work our way through this. Next chart, please. As always, join us on LinkedIn. We'd love to have you as our friend here, and you can keep up with the wide variety of things that we do and all of our partners do in the disaster recovery world. Next chart, please. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes here talking about leadership and decision-making in disaster recovery. Many of you may have heard this part of this pitch before. This is an abbreviated pitch from what we give at our in-person piece. The one thing I will say always at the beginning of this is folks, I'm a student of leadership, so please do not think that I have all of the answers. But what I will say to you is that leadership is the most critical area that defines us and our disaster recovery operations. So having said that, I will humbly move through this as best I can and offer you some thoughts about leadership and decision making in disaster recovery. Let's go to the next chart, please. We always start with our house model. We believe this to be the best model for a housing-centered disaster recovery. People always say, well, JR, why do you focus on housing? And my answer is because housing is the hardest. You know, the CDBG-DR grant allows us to work in infrastructure or economic revitalization or in some cases public service. But having said that, when you're doing housing, you're dealing with people. You're dealing with building their trust. You're dealing with the most important thing that they own. And most of these folks, by the auspices of the CDBG-DR grant, are going to be low to moderate income people who really, really need our help. So we always start with this. At the very bottom, the base is leadership and decision making. If we have strong leaders, we normally almost always have strong recoveries, and those recoveries make a difference for our citizens across the nation. Next chart, please. So here's the first question of the morning. And just to ask you to think about this and ponder it. What's more important? Is it more important to have effort, or is it more important to have outcome? So some of you at this point are saying, well, yeah, it's effort. And some of you are saying, no, it's outcomes. And some of you are saying, well, if I don't put the effort in, I don't get the outcome. Well, folks, what I will say to you is that disaster recovery as a field of study is all about outcomes. We want to provide outcomes that we planned, outcomes that we prepared for, and outcomes that we achieved. The outcomes are our credibility. You would be correct if you said, if I don't put any effort into it, I'm probably not going to get the outcome that I'm going to get. And that's certainly a correct statement. But what I would say to you is we focus on outcomes. We believe that is the right way to look at this business, this $70 billion business that we're all involved with. And so we would ask that you focus on outcomes as you think through this. This will become more enlightening as we move through the slideshow. Next chart, please. So next question, and you'll see here that oftentimes this is just more than a series of questions that I'll be asking that you kind of got to think to yourself. Well, what does this mean? What's the basis of all leadership and influence? And I just ask that you read that slowly to yourself and think about it and say to yourself, what is the basis of all leadership and influence? And I think you'll come to the same conclusion here as we move to the next chart, that the basis of all leadership and influence is trust. Trust is the coin of the realm. We have to have trust within our own lives, right? I mean, a wife has to trust her husband, a husband has to trust his wife. The basis for everything that we do in life is trust. We give trust, we accept trust, and it's even more important as we look at the broader picture of disaster recovery. Disaster recovery operations and organizations absolutely must have the trust of the public. And when that public trust is lost, then you begin to see all kinds of bad things happening, and then it becomes even worse. And candidly, the press gets involved, politicians get involved, and the thing just collapses. So what we're after here is to build trust. Now, your next question to me will be, okay, JR, I got that. How do I build trust? Let's go to the next chart. And I want you to think about that. So how do you do that? How do you do it as an individual? How do you do it as an individual leader? How do you do it as a disaster recovery organization? How do you do it in this hard business we're in? I mean, how do you do it in the world today? How do I build trust? Well, I'll give you two thoughts here on the next chart that may be of help to you. The first is your character, your own individual character. And character, by and large, means that I'm not going to lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those that do. So you need to be the leader that you want people to follow. And if you're not that leader, then I'll suggest that you modify your behavior patterns. And then the second piece of this is judgment. I cannot overemphasize the idea that judgment is the ability to make decisions and come to sensible conclusions. You're going to be faced in the disaster recovery world with a billion choices, and sometimes that in and of itself becomes problematic. So you need to be able to think to yourself, okay, how am I going to make this decision? Why am I going to make this decision? And specifically, then in your judgment, you need to communicate that decision. So I would offer to you that you build trust by being the person you want others to follow, and you have to have a pretty good track record here. We've all known people of good character who had poor judgment. We've also known people of very, very bad character who had good judgment. So these can be flopped. And what we say in the disaster recovery world is we would like the people that we work with, certainly, and the people you work with to be people of both of those. We want you to have both character and judgment. So that means being a good person who can make good decisions. So let's move to the next chart here and begin talking just a little bit about some basic definitions in here. Not trying to bore you to death, but you have to ask yourself this question: what is leadership? So this is about leadership. This is about decision making. Let's start by breaking it down and asking ourselves, what is leadership? Each of you would have your own definition, but I'm sure that all of you will come to some conclusion that leadership generally requires us to do something, which means that by and large, it's going to be an action. So let's go to the next chart and we'll define it for you. And what we say here is that leadership, in its most simplistic definition, is the action of leading a group of people or an organization. Now, of course, people make up organizations. So what I would be saying to you here is that leadership is not passive. You may be, like myself, a world-class introvert, and that is irrelevant in the world of leadership. If you're going to be a leader, You need to be a leader. That requires you to be extroverted in many ways. It requires you to communicate with people. Most importantly, it requires you to engage people. So when we talk about the action here, we're talking about engagement. Now, I'm not engaging things here. I'm engaging people. So two important parts of this definition. The first is the word action, and the second is people. People have hopes, dreams, feelings, thoughts, deserve respect, deserve a good life just as you do. So we're talking about two things, action and people on this particular chart. So let's just think about that for a second. And then let's ask ourselves another question. Let's go to the next chart and say, okay, well, if that's the definition of leadership, this idea of being action-based and dealing with people, what are the outcomes of leadership? So what I'll ask you to do at this point is think about the best leaders you've ever served with, male, female, coaches, pastors, priests, people you've known, fathers, grandfathers, people who are leaders. Ask yourself, what were the outcomes that they provided to me that made me feel as though they were a great and strong, positive leader? And I'll give you three answers to this that I think are absolutely critical in terms of outcomes. So let's go to the next chart. And what I will say to you is that that person that you just thought of provided you, whether you thought about it or not. And the more you think about it, I think you'll provide, the more you think about it, the more I think that you will come to agreement here that that person provided these outcomes. So leadership, you can see leadership. Leadership provides purpose. Why are we doing what we are doing? And we have the greatest opportunity in the world, in the disaster recovery world, especially from the public administration point of view, in that our purpose is noble. There is no greater, more noble purpose in the world than putting people back into a disaster survivor, back into a safe, sanitary, and secure home. Then the leaders also are going to provide here the motivation. Now, we could spend 10 hours talking about motivation alone. Motivation normally almost always can be broken down into two different forms. The first form is intrinsic, and that swells from inside you. Your parents, your values, your morals, your work ethic, all of that comes out of you that says, I am motivated to do this work, self-motivated, internally motivated. And of course, the second view of this is extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation are things like pay and benefits. None of us want to do this job for free. We've got to make a living. So motivation there could very well be time off. It could be the benefits that I get from a certain job. And then at the bottom, the person that you thought about earlier certainly provided you with this idea of direction. Excuse me. And direction is a point on a map, okay, if you will. So when we talk about this idea of direction, let me just say a couple of things in here. You don't have to be a jerk in order to give direction to somebody. If you're the boss, and that's a privilege to be a boss. Anytime that you get to supervise other people, you need to count that as a blessing and a privilege in your life. And what I would say to you is you don't need to be a jerk when you're giving direction to people. But now we have to ask ourselves, okay, which of these is most important in terms of disaster recovery? And I'll just give you a second to think about that. And what I think you'll come to the conclusion of is that yes, purpose is important because that's why we're doing what we're doing. Motivation is important because we all have to believe in what we're doing. But I would argue that of the three, the most important is direction. What we often see is organizations, especially in the disaster recovery world, that are directionless. They may be highly motivated and have a strong unifying purpose, but candidly, they have no direction. So if you have no direction, then any path you take is going to be successful. And candidly, that's going to lead to failure. So it may feel right, but it ain't right. So when you think about the outcomes of disaster recovery, and we need to think in these terms, right? What's my purpose? What's the motivation I'm providing? And what direction am I providing? Now, let me just speak briefly here about direction before I move on and say this. A lot of direction depends on who you're supervising, right? If you're supervising someone who is a world-class performer, you may give very, very broad direction. If you're supervising someone who is brand new to the job, who has limited experience, you maybe find yourself giving more direction. So what we find in the direction giving and guidance giving capability here is that oftentimes it depends on the workforce. It depends on who's working with us and who's working for us and our team that we've built together. So things to think about here. I will say this, in every major job I've had, whether it was in the military or in public service, I always put this on my board, on my whiteboard in my office, and I would say to myself, am I providing the right purpose? Am I providing the right motivation? Am I providing the right direction for this organization? And those are pretty good guiding questions, kind of North Star questions sometimes that you can ask yourself. Let's move to the next chart. And now we're going to separate ourselves. So oftentimes in the world, you will hear the words leadership and management used interchangeably. And what I will endeavor to point out to you here is that's not the case. We're talking about two separate and distinct entities. Leadership, by and large, is going to concern itself with people. And before I give you the answer to this one, management is going to concern itself with things. So let's go to the next chart. And what I think you see here is a simplistic definition of management is the process of dealing with controlling things. So what I hope that you're taking in your mind right now is when I use the word leadership in a sentence, I'm talking about leading people. And when I'm talking about management, I'm talking about managing things. Things are inanimate objects. Things don't have feelings. Things don't have dreams, hopes, goals, any of those things. So I really think it's an important distinction to draw here, because what we see oftentimes in the disaster recovery world is we see people who are generally good leaders. However, their management skills are lacking. And we need both of these. We need leadership and we need management. So let's move to the next chart. And I'll just show you here the two definitions put side by side. On the left, you can see the definition of leadership, the action of leading a group of people. So now we're talking about action and people. And when we're talking about this word management, we're talking about processes and things. And what I say to folks is disaster recovery requires both actions and processes. We require dedicated leaders who are willing to go out and talk to multitudes of people, constantly be on the road as if you were in a political campaign, as I recently told someone. Whether you are a politician or not is irrelevant. If you're going to do disaster recovery, you got to be engaging people. And you have to have the right processes. If your processes are skunk and they're bad, folks, you're going to fail here. I'm just telling you, you're going to fail, and you're going to fail miserably. And if you don't believe that, then I'll certainly point you to the CDBG-DR financial reports that are monthly provided by HUD, which show that somewhere between 6 and 7 of every 10 grantees are in a failed status, which means that people aren't getting recovered. And that's sad in America today. We ought to be able to do better than that. So let's go to the next chart. And I need to just ask you now to think about this thing of managing processes, managing things. What are the outcomes of that? And just spend a second in your own mind thinking about that. And then let's move to the next chart. So what you'll see here is the functions of management. This is management. This is what we do in management. We provide policy, we provide control, we provide organizational structure, we provide planning, we provide directing, but all of that leads to the outcomes of ruthless efficiency and ruthless effectiveness and ruthless efficiency. So if we're not ruthlessly efficient in disaster recovery, we're going to fail, and we're going to waste a great deal of public tax dollars, which, wait a minute, all of you out here, I'm assuming, paid your taxes this year. So it's your tax dollars that are getting wasted when we're not ruthlessly efficient. And what I'll ask you to do here is look at the blocks on the right and just think to yourself about Walmart. Walmart is certainly the sponsor of this, so I do not speak down about them. But recently, you know, if you've been in a Walmart recently, you realize that you check yourself out. Now, why are you checking yourself out? Because Walmart doesn't want to pay the cost of that clerk to stand there and check people out when they believe you can do it, and they're going to save money, and that allows them, in theory, you to save money because of that process. So think about that. And in disaster recovery, folks, we need to be ruthlessly efficient in what we're doing here. Now, that does not mean that we run roughshod over people. It does not mean that we are mean or evil or terrible to people. But folks, we've got to be absolutely efficient in what we're doing, or we won't get recovered. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing across the nation today. In too many places, is we're just not having any recovery taking place because we don't have good management. We don't have these things, these interlocking functions on the left, and we're certainly not achieving the outcomes that we're looking for on the right-hand side of the screen. So let's move to the next chart. And let's say to ourselves, if I took everything that JR just told me and put it together, what would it mean? Well, you see the outcomes of leadership on the left. This is dealing with people. because we are dealing with lots and lots and lots of people. We're dealing with our own internal teams, the people that we get the privilege to lead. We're dealing with citizens. We're dealing with building public trust. And then on the right-hand side, we talk about this idea of management, and those outcomes are being efficient and effective in the use of the public dollars to do the disaster recovery. And in the middle, we have to have leaders who provide clarity in communications. If you're an unclear communicator and you need to work on that, folks, that is a big, big deal for leaders. And finally, we have to have unity of effort. We cannot all be, the unity of effort example that I use for people that does resonate is young kids on a soccer field. If you see the under sixes, everybody running after the same soccer ball. We can't be that way in disaster recovery. We've got to have pentathletes who are doing multiple things simultaneously. I think the bottom of this chart, though, is what I really want you to take home. If you believe in, like me, being a student of leadership, certainly not a professor of it, but a student, is that we lead people, but we manage things. We lead people, we manage things. Let's go to the next chart. And now we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about this question. And I'll just ask you to think about this. What do you think the number one rule of management is? Now, management is processes and things. So what is the number one rule of management? And as you've thought about that, now I will give you the answer. Let's go to the next chart. All right, so I truly believe this to my heart, that the number one rule of management is you don't ever do anybody else's job for them. When you have two people doing the same job, you have lost efficiency and you've lost effectiveness. And at that point, organizations begin to crumble. This is the problem, if you will, with the idea that we deal with when we talk about micromanagers. If you have somebody who's doing everybody else's job for them, then I'm paying a whole lot of salaries for people who are not doing the job that I hired them to do. Now, let me be absolutely 100% crystal clear here. If you have the privilege of leading other human beings, if you have that great privilege in your life and you're blessed to do that, then what I will say to you is this: you have an obligation to coach, teach, and mentor. You have to coach, teach, and mentor your folks. That's just an absolute bedrock requirement of leadership, because there you're providing the outcomes of purpose, motivation, and direction just by teaching them how to do their job. Having said that, you can't do their job for them. And we see this constantly in a disaster recovery world, where we've got 10 people trying to get after the exact same task. And as a result of that, we're paying 10 salaries for one task. And folks, that's just terribly inefficient, and something you need to think about. So let's go to the next chart and ask ourselves, well, okay, JR, I've talked about leadership, talked about management. What does all this mean? What does all this mean to me? I'm just a disaster recovery person. What does all this mean? Let's go to the next chart. And here, ladies and gentlemen, we have welcome to the crazy train, because this is what disaster recovery is like. We have a disaster recovery in which we have you as a public servant who's trying to provide goods and services to people. We've got elected officials who are screaming at us saying, hey, wait a minute, we got to get this thing fixed quickly and efficiently. And we've got the executive branch with the governors and mayors. We've got disaster case managers running across the disaster impacted area, trying to figure out who really has a valid need and what is that need. We've got the disaster survivor, who probably is a low to moderate income person, probably elderly, or probably has children in the home of age 5 and below, and they want safe, sanitary, and secure housing, and they deserve that. Think about the idea, put on your empathy hats for just a millisecond, and think about this idea that you being a disaster survivor. Think about being homeless. Put that into your head for just a second and think about that. That's a terrible, terrible thought because of the storm. You got volunteer groups running all over a disaster impacted area. You've got this collection of contractors who show up and do all kinds of different things. One of the things I'll say about the contract community is not all contractors are horrible, evil people, but many of them will claim to be disaster experts. And if you give them a low price of a couple of $1 million, they'll solve all your problems for you. Well, if they're not giving you the outcome you want, then you may be in a problem area there. Then we move to infrastructure and economic development, which is very common because the storm is also going to impact our infrastructure and economic development. We got to sort that out. We got FEMA running throughout the disaster area, providing individual assistance to disaster survivor, providing public assistance, FEMA, IA, and PA. We've got subrecipients and contractors. We've got HUD, who then enters in with the federal community development block grant for disaster recovery or the community development block grant for mitigation. We've got this plethora of federal cross-cutting requirements. We've got the county out there or the parish that has their individual needs, and they may very well have very strong local codes. We have to make sure that we are conducting auditing ourselves. Are we doing the right things here in accordance with the law? And then, of course, compliance. Are we doing the right things that we said we were going to do? We need to make sure that we serve eligible citizens, because I'm telling you that if you don't serve eligible citizens, HUD's always going to come back and want that money back, and then people will get fired over that. You got advocacy groups like my own SBP, previously known as the St. Bernard Project. We advocate for disaster survivors, and we advocate for good disaster recovery practices across the nation. You've got procurement law, which will always come back and bite you. So you're on the crazy train. So you're riding this crazy train of disaster recovery. And what I will say to you is I truly, truly admire the public administrators who do this business. This is hard, hard work. And I make an argument that if you want something harder, go to the federal government and fight a war, because that's the only thing harder than enterprise level area wide disaster recovery. So think about these things, put them into your head, and thank you for doing the things that you do every day. Let's go to the next chart. So why do we need to think about all these things? Why is it that JR is asking me to think about all these things when it comes to disaster recovery and leadership and management? Why does he keep asking me all these questions on this webinar? So let's go to the next one. And what I will say to you is that the reason for it is that, unfortunately, in our world today, we've got a lot of mediocre outfits out there that are running disaster recoveries. When I say the word mediocre, I hope the very first thing that popped into your head in terms of a synonym would be blah, just blah. And what we see is if you're a blah organization, you're going to get your clock cleaned in disaster recovery. This is hard, hard work. And this is a $70 billion industry that you can get taken to the cleaners by contractors. You can get, and you know, I hate to say this out loud, but I always do. Citizens will lie to you. I know that's shocking to some of you on the webinar today. Having said that, you need to not have a blah organization that's trying to do disaster recovery. I make an argument when I'm talking to political figures, especially governors, that the most important job in your state is probably your emergency management folks, and then after that, because of the responsibilities that would lay on them, and then after that is certainly your disaster recovery, because we're going to do okay in the response. The federal government, everybody's going to come to help. The sexy firefighter from the Hallmark movie is going to arrive and do everything that he needs to do to save the day. And then we're going to turn it over to us, and we're the plumbers of the disaster recovery world, because we actually have to fix stuff. So disaster recovery takes a long time, and candidly, we cannot afford to be mediocre in anything that we do. So if you have mediocrity in your organization, then root it out. And if you have questions about that, we can certainly have long and flowing discussions about that. But you can't afford to be mediocre at this. This is too important. This is bringing ourselves back together. And then we have to ask ourselves the subsequent question, which is what happens if we don't recover? What happens if we're so mediocre that we don't recover? Well, let me just give you a couple of thoughts here. One is you're going to have another storm, and it's just going to get worse. And then the next thing you're going to have happen is people are going to move away, and you're going to lose your population. What happens when you lose your population? Well, then all of a sudden, the public schools got to shut down because they don't have enough money, or my kids being taught with 1 to 66 kids in a classroom, which is not good for anybody, or I don't have a fire service, or I don't have a police service because I don't have a tax base to support all that. So these are, you see counties, you see disaster impacted areas oftentimes go into what we refer to as the disaster swirl. And this is when things are just so bad that people move away. So we can't be mediocre. That's the whole point of this particular chart here. Now let's talk a little bit about how we can work our way through this. Let's go to the next chart. And your question then is, okay, JR, then how am I going to do this? How am I going to work through that crazy train? How am I going to have leaders, and how am I going to manage this thing called disaster recovery? Well, I will offer to you the next chart. And this is probably the most overused word in common American vernacular today, and the word is strategy. Unfortunately, oftentimes we use the word strategy in a sentence, but oftentimes we don't really know what it means. And here it is laid out in a disaster recovery context. So the very first thing that happens with any strategy is that I have to know what I want at the end. I have to know what do I want. All of you that are listening to my voice today have at one point or another in your life had a strategy. A strategy may have been to attract a husband or wife. It may have been to attract a mate. It may have been to buy a house. It may have been to buy a car. You knew what you wanted. You could basically describe what you wanted and you could direct yourself toward that. Well, then you got this thing in the middle called ways. So the very first thing I have to do is what I want, and then I have to determine the ways to get there. And ways here is a really good layout for what we believe are good commonsensical ways. First of all, does the way solve the problem I'm trying to solve? Is it feasible, acceptable, and beneficial, right? Does it provide a cost benefit? And we often use the term here in cost benefit analysis is the squeeze worth the juice? Do the methods under consideration meet the spirit and intent of the law? Are they moral and ethical? So I have to figure out the ways to do things. What I see oftentimes in disaster recovery is that occasionally we will see folks who can actually say, I know what I want the end state of this disaster recovery to look like. And of course, the federal government is going to give you the means, right? The means are the money, right? Money, people, and time. The federal government's giving you that normally, almost always, either through FEMA in the response phase and certainly through the CDBG-DR grant in the recovery phase, especially in long-term recovery. So what we see though is folks squirrel around with the ways. Most of the problems that I've had in my life, I knew what I wanted and I knew ways to get them. I simply didn't have the money to get there from here. And of course, I lost out on this last big lottery, but I'm in again. For those of you that are, I need y'all to get out so I can win that. That was a side thought. So the end state, think about what you want, and if you can't clearly define what you want, then you're probably haven't thought through the problem to a depth that it requires. Then figure out the ways to get there, and of course, the government is going to provide the means. They're going to provide the money. You use that money to buy yourself people and candidly buy yourself time to solve the problem. So let's go to the next chart and just spend a couple of little points here about practical influence steps for disaster recovery leaders. And this is for those of you in the disaster recovery world. I ask that you think about these things. First and foremost is that the people who control the agenda have more power and influence than those who don't. If you don't believe me, just look at any political argument that you see on any television station today. Everybody's trying to wrestle control of what are we going to be talking about. What are we going to talking about is the agenda. So what I say to disaster leaders is you absolutely must control the disaster recovery agenda, what the timelines look like, what you can do, what you cannot do. I think those are critical, and you have to map out your opponents and allies. Talk about that in a minute. You have to conduct outreach and networking. You absolutely must talk to people. Remember, we talked about earlier that one of the principles associated with leadership was this idea that it's an action and it involves people. So we absolutely have to be engaging with people. And finally, at the bottom up here, folks, you got to learn to negotiate. If you don't know how to negotiate, then I'll encourage you to go to a flea market. Go anywhere you can to learn to negotiate, because negotiation is the most critical skill. You're not going to get everything you want. For those that didn't hear it the first time, you're not going to get everything you want. You have to learn to negotiate. So if you're going to be a successful disaster recovery leader, or candidly any leader, you have to learn to negotiate, and you have to learn to get what you can live with, what you can't live with, what you can't live with, what you can't live without, and be able to articulate those things. Let's go to the next chart. So the end, of course, is that you hear people say this all the time. You have to start with the end in mind. So the way we have to start all strategy is thinking about what I want at the end state. If we start with the end in mind, everything else may come into a clearer focus. If you don't know what you want, I can't help you. Oftentimes we're called in on consulting calls, and we talk to the public administrator who says, well, I don't know what I want. Well, if you don't know what you want, also, I can't help you. You have to figure that out. And this requires some dedicated thinking time and the ability to articulate your vision of what you're seeking. And then, of course, at the end state, we need to ask ourselves some pretty good disaster recovery questions here. Who are we going to serve? Why are we going to serve them? Where are they located? Place matters here. Physical location matters. What goods and services are you going to provide? Are you going to provide everything? Are you going to provide middle ground services? What's your standards? And how are you going to serve them? And maybe most importantly, when are you going to serve them? Those are questions that you need to be able to think through in all of your disaster recovery strategies, and candidly in any problem that you have. One of the things that I would argue to grantees early on in their process is that you need to use the unmet needs assessment to inform and drive your strategy. Let's go to the next chart and spend just a second here talking about this one. You have to map out in this engagement process who your allies are, and you need to build alliances with them. Now, an ally, by definition, is someone who will stick with you through thick and thin. An alliance is somebody who will stick with you to fight a specific problem. So you need to have both of those, and you have to know who's against you. And candidly, the way that disaster recovery works best is when we engage all those people who are our opponents. They may agree with us, they may disagree with us, but what I say to folks is that the only way to know is unless you go and look eyeball to eyeball with them and tell them what you're planning and what you're going to look like, what your strategy looks like. And oftentimes this will, in fact, turn opponents into allies. This is engagement. This is leadership. Let's go to the next chart. The means, look, the means are provided to you. So the means, the money is provided to you, and with that money, you can certainly buy people and you can buy time. People say to me, well, JR, what do you mean by buying time? Well, by buying people, you're giving yourself the opportunity to do things in a multiple simultaneous fashion as opposed to a linear sequential fashion. And that makes you go more efficiently. And if you were following the Toyota production system at this point, this would all make sense to you. So you're going to get a federal register release, and that'll turn itself into an action plan. That'll get approved. You're going to turn that into a notice of award. You got to kind of figure out some things in here. How can I manage volunteer labor? How can I manage the administrative and planning funds? And how can I use the FEMA Disaster Case Manager Grant to help me get to what I'm after? All these are means. These are things that are available to me. I just have to be smart in my use of all of them. Let's go to the next chart. And finally, the ways, right? So how are we going to recover? All right, what's the method of distribution? Am I going to use subrecipients? There's risk with that. Am I gonna provide money for economic revitalization or infrastructure? Am I gonna do it myself? I'm gonna use a contractor. I'm gonna be centralized. I'm gonna be decentralized. Am I gonna go into this idea of buyouts and relocations? So you have to turn all that into policy and plans over the course of time. But you got to figure out the ways. How am I going to do this? Just this morning, I spent a great deal of time on an action plan that was available for comment, and the thing that hit me was that it was really strong on a lot of different areas, but the biggest weakness was how are we going to do this? It was weak on how are we going to do this? So people come up with a lot of big ideas and they use a lot of words, but if we don't know how we're going to do it, then we're probably going to end up doing it poorly and fail. And then we add to ourselves to the list of failed disaster recoveries across the nation. Let's go to the next chart. So when you're building this, don't blame the means because they're provided. You're being given here a major opportunity to do disaster recovery, especially with the CDBG-DR grant. So I would ask that you think about that. Most action plans, and I'll just say many here, not most, many action plans are not plans. They are vague and meaningless. And one of the ones that I reviewed this week, again, back to the how are we going to do this? Well, it doesn't really get into the how. It just kind of says we've got this money and we're going to figure it out as we go along. Folks, that's not a plan. That in essence, when you do that, you're starting the bad path of building an inaction plan. So action is a verb here. We're trying to turn it into a noun, I guess. Many grantees can't visualize a recovery and they don't know what they want to accomplish, and therefore they don't. You're going to have to make as many good decisions as you can along the way, and if you need to change. Make another deliberate decision and change. Most disaster recovery operations fail because they never had a good strategy going in, and that's pretty common across the disaster recovery spectrum. Let's go to the next chart. So a couple of things I'll ask for leaders in terms of what can I do at a practical level? As a leader, you can always do your homework. Homework is always important to us. And a couple of things we always talk about in the homework piece is that as a leader in disaster recovery, you have to know how many citizens you're dealing with. You have to know how much of the grant you've spent. You have to know how much you're going to be spending on each citizen, because all of this, doing your homework allows you to have credibility. And if you have credibility, that will allow you to accomplish your outcomes that you designed in your strategy. Let's go to the next chart. And a couple of things here as I end this up and just say this. Look, if you're going to lead in one of these programs, and I hope all of you aspire to do that because it's a great and noble profession, but you have to answer these questions because you're going to be under pressure. You're going to handle tough times. You're going to have negative results. You're going to have negative outcomes. Can you handle being wrong? Can you handle hard things? Can you make hard decisions? So if you're aspiring to be a leader, I ask that you think about these things. And this is a pretty good self-assessment here of who we are as human beings, who we are as leaders. Because the one thing the leader has always got to be able to do is look themselves in the mirror and say, you know, am I doing all the right things here? So this is a pretty good checklist. Let's go to the next chart. And what I will say to you here is the fox and the hedgehog. This is from an essay on Tolstoy's view of history. And what we say here is that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. What I say to you in disaster recovery leaders across the nation is successful disaster recovery leaders, you got to know a whole bunch of stuff. You got to be the fox. You got to know everything there is to know about your program. That includes the strategy, planning, and policy, the program management. You got to know a little bit about construction management. And as you get into it, you got to learn more and more. You got to know the finance and accounting, and you got to focus on outcome. With all that, let's go to the next chart. And here you see here you see our successful program layout. And we start at the bottom down here with decision making and leadership. Next month in our standard webinar, we're going to talk about organizational effectiveness, which is the idea of how do I build an organization that helps do the leadership things that I need to get done here? How do I pull all this together? So we'll be talking about that next month. Let's go to the next chart. And any questions, Olivia? We're seeing in the chat box, or any comments?
I'm seeing none, but if anyone has questions, feel free to go ahead and type them in the Q&A and chat box, and if I see them, I'll read them aloud.
Okay.
But no questions at this time, so I'll just move along.
Okay, very cool. Let's go to the next chart. So again, we are holding the Leader Practitioner course in Savannah, Georgia, January 9th through the 12th. Email us if you have an interest in attending, and your bosses will approve this. Again, this is paid for by the Walmart Foundation. So in essence, it is a scholarship. Walmart Foundation, like us, believes strongly in the idea, the concept that disaster recovery in America needs help. Public servants, public administrators need help in doing it. And I will just say this, you will learn far more from the people sitting on your left and right than you will from me or any of my great cadre that teach these courses. And we really think it's a great learning experience. And most importantly, we try desperately to make sure it's a fun event. Let's go to the next chart. Again, we're offering the finance leader course 6 to 8 February in Savannah. And this is a per seat cost venture. So this is not paid for by the Walmart Foundation. So we ask that if you have finance directors in your organization that you think would benefit from this, I will tell you that this is very, very technical in terms of its instruction. You're going to spend a lot of time talking about financial management and a lot of time talking about DRGR, the grant system, and all the interfaces that take place, and trying to figure out what check sheets make sense for you before you end up paying people. Let's go to the next chart. So again, the next one we're going to do here will be on December 14th. That'll be organizational effectiveness and disaster recovery. I ask you to join us for that one. And then, of course, you can see the rest of those that we're planning out for the rest of the year. Let's go to the next chart. And we always ask that you join us on LinkedIn, follow us on LinkedIn. We believe that we do put out quite a bit of social media presence on this particular platform, and ask that you join us with that. Let's go to the next chart. And I believe that's
That
it.
is all.
So with that, I pass back to Olivia. Any questions or comments? Are we done?
Not seeing any questions. So thank you, JR. I think we'll just end it here. So everyone, thank you on behalf of SBP and the Walmart Foundation for joining us today. We hope to see you on future webinars or in person at one of our leader practitioner courses or the upcoming finance leader course. And I will be sending out the slides from today, so look out for that, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.